All right. Welcome back, everyone. Welcome back from the break. We'll start to settle in here over the next couple minutes. They're dealing with a couple technical issues in the back, but we'll be started here in just a moment. Good conversations held by all. Lots of exciting conversation. This next panel coming up is extraordinary in that in the last two, we've seen all the different types of platform trials and excitingly some of the non-oncology platform trials. You also saw that we were slightly weak on the payer connection as well, as we had a number of scientists and advocates who were very excited about the science of platform trials. And we hadn't always made the complete connection across the continuum, which is what we're going to try to make sure we do on this panel. So we have everything from the investor view to the patient view and some payer view. John Glasspool is going to be leading us here through this. So let me introduce John, my colleague at the Center for Biomedical Innovation and NUDIGS, and a former executive in the pharma industry in too many places for me to name them all. But thank you, John, for leading this and assembling this panel.
Okay, thanks very much, Mark. I think many of you, given the time of day, will be nervous about your flights, taxis, trains, planes, and automobiles. Let me assure all of you that as a former pharma executive who used to catch planes, trains, and automobiles, we will finish on time. You don't need to panic. You don't need to keep an eye on your watch. The second thing that I would say for all of you that have done extensive presentation skills training throughout your careers is that, surely Glasspool has been trained in presentation skills. And yes, I have been. And I was also told never speak at a lectern because you look like a bulldog chewing bumblebees. But unfortunately, as there's 5 people sitting down, you've got me chewing bumblebees. This is the panel where, as Mark said at the introduction, we're going to bring you back to really the start of the conference with the elephant. And the elephant that we're really dealing with here is the fact that we think conceptually for patients these are very good. We think conceptually for cost they're very good, but each stakeholder has a different perspective. And the goal of this panel is to tease out the complexity that we're dealing with, and then what are the different views of the different stakeholders. My own perspective of why MIT NUDIGS is so powerful is because it does take a multi-stakeholder perspective. I think as an industry, and I mean broadly as an industry now, from regulation through to pharma companies, we're very good at optimizing our silos. We can optimize manufacturing like nobody's business. We can improve electronic data submissions for regulatory. It's much more difficult to optimize the horizontal. The analogy that I like to use and share when I'm thinking about how do you get to the best of the breed in terms of multi-stakeholder is Rawls' theory of justice. For those of you that didn't study philosophy, Rawls was an Oxford professor who I had the benefit of being taught by, that in essence said the judgment of good justice was it didn't matter which person you were in the justice system, whether you were the judge, the prosecutor, the defender, or the defendant, if the system was just, you would feel very comfortable being in that room. You may prefer some settings than others, but at the end of the day, if everybody could agree in a blinded fashion, this system is just, that would be the way to judge a justice system. And the analogy I use is here, if we believe that platform clinical trials are the way to develop drugs to the optimal outcome of patients, we should be able to sit ourselves in every different stakeholder position and say, I might feel slightly uncomfortable in some positions, but overall, this is the best way to go. That's the analogy that I would leave you with. I think, as Mark also said, for the first time on this panel, 1, we're multi-stakeholder. 2, for the first time, we have an investor who's going to share a very interesting presentation, very short one, around systems that he's dealing with. But what I'm going to do now is turn to the panel, ask them to introduce themselves and share with you their stakeholder perspective, and then we're going to move to Peter's short presentation. So Naomi, maybe we could start with you and move down.
So my perspective is this is very encouraging. All right, as payers, we're concerned about the sustainability, the affordability, and access of the healthcare system. Personally, what motivates me now is I have led through the years, and now am more in a representation role, the Blue Cross and Blue Shield Association Technology Evaluation Center. And I worry. On our watch, I don't want to see the end of innovation because we can't afford it. I want to know how we can afford innovation, and in a way, we talked about justice, that it is just. I think we are seeing some signs of a very perhaps disparate economy and healthcare system, in and out, and affordability. So what do I think is promising about the platform approach? One is, it seems quite efficient. Two, it has the potential for sustainability to keep on asking questions of accumulated data. I have always been impressed with the Early Breast Cancer Clinical Trialists Collaborative. For more than 30 years, they have followed approximately 100,000 women in trials of early breast cancer. And perhaps most of our knowledge of the treatment of early breast cancer comes from those efforts. In many ways, I think this has the potential to be even better, because it wouldn't be following after the fact. It would actually be shaping before the fact, with room to adapt to new things that you want to know. One would also hope that it would contribute to greater affordability, and that we would see some cost improvements from this effort. Now, I know you folks always tell us that these drugs are so expensive because look at all the failures. But this shows promise to reduce the number of failures. One would hope that there would be a corresponding improvement in the affordability and access. I see challenges, as with everything, to a novel idea, but I do think our speaker this afternoon brought us back to what you might call a tipping point, the introduction of the standardized railroad gauge. Now, how do you think you could commute to New York City from Connecticut and New Jersey and wherever if each of these railroads were run by a separate company using its own track? You would never get to the Port Authority.
Thank you, Naomi. Mathieu, over to you and the rare disease space.
Yes. Good afternoon, everybody. So EURORDIS is the rare disease patient organization in Europe. So I will speak from the patient organization point of view, and then from the rare disease, and I would like then to respond to the gentleman on the back on your previous question for the panel. From a patient organization, that makes a lot of sense, and I'm wondering why nobody thought about it before. I don't have any more to say regarding this, right? It's such a good idea that it makes total sense, then we should do it, and as soon as possible. We should do it, that's fine, but we should not forget a couple of things, right? Everything is about adaptive, everything is about innovation here. So by having this new platform tries mechanism, maybe we can try, and again, that's a motto from this morning, to engage with the HTA and the payers, right? Because that would make a lot of sense, okay? To engage them as early as possible to define the endpoints, to define what they really need to assess, and then to deliver a program which is adaptive and efficient, reducing the attrition rate, or at least, and that's to come back to a comment earlier this morning, to know when a drug is going to fail earlier in the development progress comparing with its competitors. Makes a lot of sense, right? Then I would like to discuss a bit, and that's because I'm from Europe, where can we organize that in Europe? I think public-private partnership are the place to do that. The IMI, that was heavily mentioned earlier by Luc, is the right place to do it, and I think they're really engaging in that way, and EURORDIS is fully supporting these initiatives. Then in terms of patient engagement, and a lot have been, usually when I'm inviting to speak at conferences, the patient perspective in this and how we engage patient, well, it doesn't change much. Platform try or not platform tries, or whatever design you may come up with, it doesn't change. Just engage earlier, define patient-centric development program. That's it, okay? There's no rocket science here. It's super easy. Don't come up with platform try is a new way to engage with patient. No, just do it right. And if it's not a platform try, do it right as well. We will welcome this. And we're trying to organize ourselves in the patient community to answer those requests. So pattern flying is not an excuse to do something good, right? Should be doing things good before that. So that's a nice thing. Then I would like to come to the rare disease area. Rare disease might not be the first target for platform trials, right? Because there's not so many research done there, not so many competitors. Well, this is true and not true. If I look at the numbers of orphan designation given by the EMA, cystic fibrosis, 20 company, 24 orphan designation. Systemic sclerosis, 12 designation. Okay, this one is really hard to say. Hepatocellular carcinoma, 15. Gliomas, 24. Niemann-Pick, 5, etc., etc. So we have clusters of disease, right, that could come up. I can share my slides if you want.
I thought there might be more.
That's Peter the investor getting an inside scoop on what's
You're
going
picking
on in the
in
market.
It's a super interesting slide. Sorry.
I'll show you a slide later.
But that's the idea. We have clusters where we have orphan drug designation, right? Because as soon as we have a product entering, maybe not the market, but an orphan drug designation, then we have other companies plugging into the program because the field is a bit de-risked, right? It makes sense. In front of this, so rare disease, not all of them, but some, why not, right? In front of them, and this is completely disconnected, if I look at what's happening in the rare disease patient advocacy world, we're trying to structure in Europe our members, so disease-specific organization, where we have clusters of development to be sure that they can be partners from the partners for the companies that are developing product. So in two different topics, we're seeing the same thing. Clinical development, clusters, more development, platform try, why not? And facing that, a patient advocacy landscape which is getting structured. So those two elements are converging to be sure that platform try, why not? It will not be the holy grail for the rare disease research, for sure, but let's keep in mind, let's not forget about it, because it might be useful in the future.
Okay, thanks, Mathieu. Jane, maybe we could go to you next
Okay,
and build on the patient perspective that Mathieu shared.
So I'm a long-term, which means over 30 years, cancer survivor. And I've been involved in advocacy since then, but much more so recently. As I no longer, Gemini Group is because I'm an identical twin. It was my consulting business. Now I spend virtually all my time doing volunteer advocacy work, especially in clinical trials. And if you look at my background, you'll see I have slightly relevant, but not too relevant background that informs my advocacy. That's true of virtually all patient advocates. We have other lives. And that's one of the reasons why it's so rich. Now, what do we mean by patient advocacy? You know, there's organizations, there's individual patients, there's all kinds of things. It's such a popular thing, patient-centric, patient-informed. One thing I love that Gigi said this morning, and that was, you know, we have to all be here together. You know, one of the things that patient advocates often get is what I call the ladies auxiliary model. We have them on the side here and we engage them. That's not, in my opinion, patient advocacy. So we have to all talk together, and I'm so happy that on this panel we actually also have a payer, Naomi, and all of these other people. So that's one thing. Another reason that I think I'm here is because I'm the lead advocate on the I-SPY trial you've heard a lot about, and also the TAPER trial you've heard virtually nothing about. Those are my teasers. Catch me offline. I'm not going to talk too much about them unless we have time. But I just will say the TAPER trial has about 17 drugs. They're all FDA approved, but they're for new indications, so that's very exciting. Just let me briefly say a few other things. I loved a lot of the things that Mathieu said. This morning, someone asked him, what are the barriers? And he said, human nature. Maybe it's because I'm a psychologist, I thought that was a great answer. But then we heard at lunch also, it takes great leaders. And I can tell you, in the I-SPY trial, for sure, we have two of our great leaders here, and others, Laura and Anna. Others, Don Berry's name was brought up a million times. It's those people, you know, there are some brilliant people, some of us heard last night, a brilliant person. He told me he only has 90% of his brain. I have, I hope, 40% of his brain. But we do what we can do. But it's the brilliant people, and not only brilliant, it's the innovative people. Mathieu also said, you know, we don't have to do this only in platform trials, it's all trials. I agree with him, but one of the reasons that platform trials, in my opinion, are where this is happening is because these are the leaders, these are people who are willing to step out and say, if we do the same thing as we've always done it before, we're not going to get very far fast enough. You know, one of my advocate mantras is patients don't have the luxury of patience. So we have to innovate. Platform trials, by their nature, are innovative. And someone this morning said, or this afternoon said something about where's there room for innovation. Let me tell you, there's more room in platform trials for innovation than anywhere else. By nature, they're innovative now, and there's all kinds of little places. They're continuously learning. One of the things that we've only sort of hinted at here that I feel very strongly about is that we're not doing a different kind of trial. We're not doing platform trials. We've changed the paradigm to continuous learning, a learning process. And that's continuous learning in every different aspect. And you know, someone said we could do adaptation in a frequentist model. We sort of can, and we do that because people were trained that way. But the Bayesian model is a continuous learning model. That's how our brains really work. That's the way we learn. More data changes the way we think. That's the statistics I think we need to be doing. And that's certainly, in a broader sense, what we do with these platform trials. So, you know, those are a few of the things that I sort of want to throw out there. Some people have asked me what it means to be the lead advocate, just how advocates have been involved. I certainly will reinforce what Mathieu said, early and often. And in both I-SPY and TAPER, there's room for a lot of different investigators. And all along the way, we've made sure to engage advocates along with them. And it doesn't always make a difference. It doesn't change things 100%. But it does, in some ways, change things. It, I think, puts a little bit pressure on the investigators. It helps the community, the patients, understand. And it makes patients want to be in these kinds of trials and want to be part of the solution. So much more detail for anyone that wants to catch me, but I think I'll pass on to Eric at this point.
Jane, thanks. So we've heard that the payers like it, we heard the rare disease likes it. Jane and the patient advocates feel it's important. Eric, give us the takeaway as the innovator.
And not everybody, not every patient likes it, but the ones that want to move forward do. Or will it convince them?
So thanks. Eric Rubin, I'm a medical oncologist, and I oversee early oncology clinical development at Merck. And I'll disclose that you're probably going to get somewhat of a biased perspective from me because I've known many of the folks, including Jane, Laura, Anna, Don Berry for a long time, and have been I guess an internal advocate at my company for the advantages of platform trials. When we've been involved in many of them, including the Battle study, which I don't think has been mentioned before, an MD Anderson study that, again, was Don Berry's idea, I-SPY 2, where we've involved in LungMap, and some of the other ones, newer ones that were mentioned today, we're considering as well. There are a lot of advantages that have been, I think, that have been discussed already, and these certainly, I think, viewed positively by industry. I'm going to mention one that I'm not sure has been covered well, but then I am going to try to get to some of the concerns from an industry perspective, just so those are out on the table. One of the advantages for these that really is at the essence of something like I-SPY 2 is that we're trying to find the patients who are most likely to benefit from our drugs. I mean, I think that's pretty easy to understand that. In practice, that can actually be difficult, particularly if you're trying to use tests that might go across histologies, for some of the targeted therapies or even immunotherapies. What test do you use? And there are ways to do this. One can, if you're absolutely sure that these would be called predictive biomarkers that end up into diagnostic tests. If you're pretty sure you know what the biomarker would be, you can design what's called an enrichment study where you only enroll patients who test positive. And this can be an efficient way to get to a signal. Crizotinib in ALK-positive lung cancer is a good example of that route. But the problem with that is that if you guess wrong, then you've wasted a considerable amount of time, and our ability to actually identify the right biomarkers or tests in a given tumor type is actually relatively poor. And there are plenty of examples of where one does that type of approach and the study's negative, and then you're back to, well, is there still time to try another approach or with the drug, or is it too late? Another approach is to enroll all comers, people with a certain tumor type, and pre-specify a particular biomarker positive population to look at. The problem with this is if you're in a lower prevalence biomarker, you either have to enroll a ton of patients to get sufficient power to actually ask that question, or if you're just enrolling a set number of all comers, you might not have enough patients at the end of the study to answer that question. So there's some pitfalls for that approach as well. And this is where designs like I-SPY 2 come in, where you're starting with defined biomarker classes. And the beauty of the study is that as it goes forward, it actually finds the best match. So it starts off agnostic. You don't really have to know, and it will tell you which is the best match, so that you then you have some certainty that you've actually found the group of patients who are most likely to benefit from the drug. And we're actually using this for internal sponsored studies. We like the approach so much that when we're doing our platform internal studies, we use a similar approach that's taken from the I-SPY 2. We have an interesting study that's going to start soon in collaboration with the Parker Institute in lung cancer, for example. We're looking at a number of combinations with pembrolizumab, and we hope that by using this approach, can find for each combination the right patient group that would match that. So moving on to concerns, there are really two concerns. One is speed or time, always a concern for industry, right? We want to have our drugs out to patients as rapidly as possible, and there's always concern that, could we do it faster if we just did our own study, recognizing, for all the reasons that's been brought up before, that it may not be as efficient as using an external platform study. The second is loss of control. Again, I think it's been mentioned already, but again, there's concerns that maybe they won't take care of our drug in the best possible way. We'd much rather have that control so that we don't have to worry about someone else making decisions on study design or amendments or things like that. That said, I would say that I think by our involvement in a number of platform studies, and I think it's not just Merck. You can see this throughout the oncology industry, which is what I'll speak for. I can't speak for the non-oncology groups. I think you're seeing an increased use of this approach, I think, for the obvious reasons.
Okay, thanks, Eric. I'm going to hand over to Peter now to give you a very interesting perspective, I think, from a very interesting company on the investor side. I want to give you a warning now that all of you that have questions, start being prepared, because when Peter's finished his, we will open it up to questions. So Peter, over to you.
Sure. So I will, tech permitting, show you guys a few slides from a talk I gave at UPenn a couple weeks ago that just has some great visuals. So I'm an investor. I focus on development stage biotech. I'm a scientist by training as well. I've been doing this for about 15 years. And as an investor, you get to be an observer, a witness to essentially lots of games of chess. We see every unmet need out there as basically a game of chess of us, and I mean it as a kind of collective us, cumulative innovation on this planet against the chess pieces of the disease arrayed, on the other side. And in the earlier days of my career, I would say that each company was handcrafting an individual chess piece, hoping that they didn't lop the head off what they hoped would be a queen and turn it into a bishop, and oh no, they lopped it off again, now it's a pawn, and oh no, it's disintegrating in their hands, now it's dust, right? Like that drug development process is incredibly risky, and if you can get one chess piece over the line, get it FDA approved, you felt victorious. And increasingly, I would say that the process of developing a drug, well, this is overstating it a bit, but it's getting to be the point where you can almost 3D print whatever chess piece you want. You have a target in mind, you want an antibody against it. Antibodies are now reasonably well characterized. The oligo field is going in that direction. It's still hard, but those companies that still are really obsessed with just getting that one chess piece over the line are missing the fact that there's a lot of these chess pieces coming to market at the same time. And the question is, what's your chess strategy? Do you have multiple chess pieces? How are you coordinating them? And those companies that have the ability to build any kind of bishop, a bishop for lung cancer, a bishop for maybe autoimmune disorders or whatever, if they don't understand the game of chess that is being played, like all the other drugs and how they interconnect, then how do they know on which chessboard that bishop would be most valuable, right? So in the last 5 years, I would say that it has become just so much more complex for companies. And you're seeing them start to not be able to get the funding they want to develop their one chess piece because investors are reacting to the complexity that they're facing. And we've witnessed a different, more sophisticated approach out there by watching how Gilead came to dominate HIV, right? Acquiring or developing all the various components they needed to create a cocktail. They did the same thing in hepatitis C. Eli Lilly has done a great job of assembling an entire toolkit of drugs in diabetes, DPP-4, SGLT2, GLP-1, biosimilar basal insulin. You could imagine them going to a Kaiser and saying, we'll give you a flat deal, whatever, a few $1,000s for every one of your patients as long as 85% of them are treated with the Lilly plan. They could do that. I mean, you'd have to tweak a few things with CMS or whatever, but the very fact that they could do that means that that represents a threat to companies like Merck or like Sanofi that have developed individual great chess pieces, Januvia or Lantus, but then didn't really develop an entire strategy around it, right? So there's old school tactics and new school strategy. And so we're watching how oncology is playing out, right? You could take a look at a company like Roche, which using conventional methods of developing one chess piece at a time has basically come to dominate several lines of HER2-positive breast cancer, right? And if they wanted to, they could control price for an entire regimen, multiple lines of therapy, several combinations. That's pretty cool. Now, what if Roche were starting off with all those components all at the same stage of development, phase 1 today? How would they develop them? Would they really develop Herceptin individually and then Perjeta individually and then Kadcyla individually, right? Or could you imagine them developing them all at once as hopefully an intelligently selected paradigm of treatment with multiple lines of therapy, multiple combinations, and pit that against what? Standard of care, right? So you route all patients down arm 1, call it the kitchen sink regimen, or arm 2, which is standard of care, and they blow it out of the water. Right? That would be very effective pretty fast. Submit that to the FDA, and because they control all the drugs, they control the pricing. If they wanted to, they could come up with a plan like, hey, we'll charge you $100,000 for every year the patient's alive. So Big Pharma is already running these platform trials, in a sense, stretched out over a long period of time in the case of HER2-positive breast cancer, or now in the case of IO, it's kind of clumsy. But you look at what Merck's doing, what Bristol's doing, I'd say that what they're missing out on is re-randomizing individual patients and keeping track of how they navigate through the Merck or the Bristol constellation of trials. But there's already some thought of how to do that, right? And so once they solve that, you will have multiple of these moonshot programs or constellation programs. It's more than just one stellar body that patients are working their way through. And could it be that they might start using diagnostics that don't wait for somebody to relapse, for a tumor to just come back before they hit them with the next line of therapy, but they detect merely the slowing of the tumor's shrinkage. That already is an early sign that the line of therapy you're giving is starting to fail. Hit them again. Nobody plays chess by advancing one piece at a time and seeing how far you can get with it before advancing your next one. It's not like one of those Hollywood movies where the bad guys come at the hero one at a time and get beat up, right? In the real world, just flood the guy. In this case, the disease is not the hero. I'll work on that analogy.
We got the concept, Peter. We got the concept.
Yeah, right? So what you see are companies that control all these agents. And they're able, eventually, if they want to, they can control the price. And I think what's really interesting for us here in the room to think about is what happens when there aren't companies trying to dominate in a given area that's really challenging, like GBM, right? Glioblastoma is tough. There's no company that's really showing any traction, assembling a toolkit, trying to dominate. We sort of can't figure out what drug might work. I'm going to stipulate, I would ask you guys to stipulate that every drug on the GBM landscape has about half a unit of FDA approvable activity, which is to say they will all fail individually. But if you were to imagine how you would mix and match, let's say 6 drugs in 3 lines of therapy in various combinations, and pit that against this current standard of care, which 6 drugs could you choose? Could you negotiate the rights from those 6 companies to those 6 drugs into one specialty pharmacy that would then charge, let's say, per year that the patient is alive, right? If you left them all to own the drugs and merely did a nonprofit kind of study, you'd be empowering them later to each charge $100,000 for their drug per year, right? Because they would each insist that my drug was crucial to the success of that kitchen sink regimen. So you'd have to get the commercial rights as well in order to have a shot at trying to keep the total cost somehow manageable. Right? This isn't the model that we have yet, but if you take the learnings from iSpy and what pharma is doing internally, it becomes possible to imagine how one might fund a relatively small, dedicated company that's trying to make a real dent in GBM by bringing together a bunch of these not quite individually good enough assets. Right?
Is that a point to share your RA capital system?
Yeah.
Perhaps?
So some disclaimers, don't buy any public stocks I might mention. So I'm going to skip a bunch of this stuff because it's not relevant to the talk. But we create these maps, these visual displays of these chessboards to show you. So, wow, I didn't realize I had that much intro stuff. Okay, so this is actually, I'm going to start with something really simple, hereditary angioedema. You had mentioned before how there's, an opportunity for some of these kinds of platform trials in orphan disorders. There's a number of different drugs in development. So in the case of hereditary angioedema, you're basically missing C1 inhibitor. That inhibits kallikrein. When you don't inhibit kallikrein, a different part of your body might swell up. If it's your leg, it's awkward. If it's your throat, it could kill you, right? So you got to inhibit kallikrein. And the various drugs that can do that in this pathway, are in some cases just replacements for C1, plasma-derived. In some cases, antibodies that might inhibit kallikrein or small molecules, right? So there's lots of these different options. And rather than try to study each of them as individual components, let's take a look at a kind of big picture view of what these drugs all look like together on a single map. So this is an example of one of our maps. It's a subcomponent of an orphan disorder map with loss of function diseases where you're missing extracellular factors. So all these diseases can be treated by just replacing what's missing. And so we split it out by those drugs that are given IV relatively frequently versus sub-Q or orally, and therefore can be self-administered, and then further subdivide it. And these are analyses of the individual programs. And if you guys can see the symbology at all, I know it's small, but 3 dots means phase 3, M means marketed, little open circle means preclinical, 1 dot's phase 1. And what you'll see here is you've got a dominant drug that Shire sells, Cinryze, that generates 700 million sales. And another company called Dyax was developing a drug that, unlike Cinryze, which has to be infused twice a week, Dyax's drug can be given sub-Q once every 2 weeks. And what you saw there is that Shire, simply to protect itself, to upgrade itself and future-proof itself against disruption by Dyax, bought Dyax's drug, right? You know, what would you rather get, a sub-Q injection once every 2 weeks or an infusion twice a week? But then you've got these oral drugs up here, and you know, they may represent not so much a threat to a once every 2 week drug, but you know, maybe patients start on it, right? And so you start to think about how down the road, if you map out the chessboard like this, which is a little bit, well, looks more like a chessboard, you got Shire and another company, CSL Behring, that each have more advanced programs in the standard of care, frequently administered IV. And they have a gap in the infrequent sub-Q and a gap in the oral. And what you saw is that Shire, you know, filled that gap by picking up Dyax. And you know, what's the next chess move you're going to make? You're probably not going to bother with the frequent IV drugs anymore. I'd argue that it's maybe a little too late to be going for the infrequent sub-Q. I wouldn't go trying a different mechanism of action altogether. But they might want to think about filling those gaps by picking up some of these components down below, right? So this is just the simplest chessboard I could think of. It's almost tic-tac-toe. And I did that just to sort of warm you guys up for what B-cell malignancies look like. So non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. This is where you'll find Rituxan, and you'll find ibrutinib, the BTK inhibitor, PI3K delta drugs. You got IO drugs on there, tons of things. So before you saw what that map looked like of hereditary angioedema, look at all the stuff in development for, you know, for this cancer. Now here's what the solution matrix looks like for B-cell malignancies. You got a lot more pharmas that are interested. And this is the view of what it looked like a few years ago. Each of those companies, the large ones, had a couple of drugs, you know, here and there, maybe one. And you had a bunch of targets up above. And we defined CD20, BTK, and PI3K delta as the must-haves. These are the proven mechanisms. They'll really put a dent in the cancer, and you might want to mix and match them in various combinations. And then there's the nice-to-haves, maybe you know, validated follow-ons. So CAR-T makes for a great last-line therapy now. BCL2, venetoclax specifically, is a great drug. And so you know, ultimately, we simplified the chessboard down to this. There are other mechanisms, but we just didn't want to crowd this thing with tons of columns. And what you saw is the various chess moves these companies started to make. AbbVie buying Pharmacyclics for a ton of money, picking up a PI3K delta from Infinity. AstraZeneca buying Acerta to pick up a BTK and a PI3K delta. Gilead picking up a BTK from Ono. And ultimately, Gilead buying a Kite for almost $12 billion. And so now the chessboard looks like this. But there's an interesting strategy that's playing out here. As these big guys are equipping themselves with more chess pieces in order to mix and match drugs, to own multiple lines of therapy, there's a little company on there that is basically offering an alternative to the old school approach of a physician ordering a different drug from each of 3 companies. And they're saying, well, how about you instead just order our CD20, our PI3K delta, and our PD-1, you know, in whatever combination you like. Right, they're sort of taking that more Eli Lilly approach that Lilly's taken in diabetes. These aren't things that will necessarily be co-formulated like Gilead's HIV drugs or Hep C drugs. That lends to a really easy commercial model because it's just a single product. But these are things that are going to have to be infused and then given as other drugs given as tablets, several lines of therapy. And I would argue that if you looked at them in a conventional way and said, well, you know, let's look at your CD20. You're what, the 4th to market? Why would I care about your phase 3 CD20? Or you analyze your PI3K delta. Well, you're late to the game. What do I care about your PI3K delta? Then you're missing the fact that, yes, they are not differentiated in any one of those columns necessarily. But when you put it together, they're the only ones developing a CD20 and PI3K delta combined as a line of therapy in DLBCL and getting better results than you would have with either one alone. So a little company is trying to skate to where the puck is going to be by focusing its pipeline on this one problem, by defining itself by the problem it aims to solve. And in that way, actually, arguably, either threatening or presenting an opportunity to these big pharmas, right? So this is how it plays out.
The key thing there, Peter, is if you think of developing all these roadmaps individually versus taking that disease roadmap and developing a platform trial to make that happen.
Yeah, well, so starting off with a map, by the way, seeing all the different chess pieces, how they're not necessarily well coordinated, I think it's a start. We collaborated with the folks that are working on the MyCat trial to visualize melanoma with them and start to imagine what might a multi-arm trial with re-randomization look like. Which drugs would you like to have? Which drugs are going to be ready to dovetail into that trial in 2019? Right? You'd like IL-2 maybe, but well, we're not sure we're ready for an IL-2 unless you go with Nectar. What if Nectar doesn't want to play ball with you? Well, here's 2 other companies, keep an eye on them, court them, and by 2019, if you're lucky, they'll have something that's in the clinic and looks good and you can work it into your trial. Right? So if you're trying to ultimately bring people together, but there's one linchpin drug and you're not sure that company will play ball, you have to work around it. And these maps show you what the options are. The Avises, they're number 2, they'll try harder. Right? And so we laid that out for them, and when we went to ASCO with them, we introduced them to some of these companies that were not necessarily all that well known to them, but represented viable alternatives to the incumbents. Maybe talk to Array and get their BRAF mech in case Roche doesn't want to give you theirs. Yeah. Right? I'll pause there.
Peter, thank you. I think those maps really, for me, I like the work RA Capital does, and the maps really illustrate how complex the field is and why, if you're looking to develop in a single disease, why you should be thinking about platform trials. With that, questions for the panel? You've stunned them into silence. Maybe I could ask you a question, Jane, to kick things off while people are thinking of their own questions. We hear very much the term patient-centered drug development, Jane. How would you like to see patients and their advocates engage in the design of a study?
Well, I think the first and most important thing is that we are asking the things that are important to patients. And it might sound like, oh, well, all patients want is to live longer. But that's not quite right, because they want to live well. So, for example, Peter, I think we have to really worry about the toxicities. And Naomi talked about the early breast cancer trialists, which in some ways is great, but I think they had the wrong endpoint. And they still look at the wrong endpoint because they only look at breast cancer mortality. And a lot of these drugs also have some toxicities that could, and patients want to know the overall survival. So we have to make sure that we're asking questions that are important to patients. That's number one. Then in designing the trials, we want to make sure that the trials are things that will be relatively easy for patients to enroll in and interesting for patients to enroll in and available to patients. So I think Janet talked about, and other people this morning, about this sort of mismatch. We have lots and lots of trials and lots of patients wanting to get trials, and the two don't necessarily meet. And it's not necessarily because we need Match.com. We have some of those. But the eligibility requirements on a lot of trials exclude lots of patients. And the travel requirements, most trials are in academic centers, at least in oncology, and most oncology patients are treated in the community. So we have to find ways to get out to the community. That's one of the things that TAPER, which is more of a pragmatic trial, is actually trying to do, get out there, and it's also trying to change the practice of clinicians to understand what personalized medicine is all about. So those are a couple of key things. Patients really want to understand, at least oncology patients, how does this affect their whole patient life, not just progression-free survival or something, the typical endpoint. And we don't only want to know, what proportion of patients gets a type 3 toxicity. We want to know the time course of different toxicities, because every patient has different values about which toxicity is important. A pianist doesn't want neuropathy, but there are other people that are really, really averse to nausea. So different people, sometimes we see these spider plots and patients get to pick the next therapy by the toxicity profile. But it's very rare that those kinds of data are presented in a reasonable way. So those are just a few points. We want to make sure that the informed consent actually helps the patient understand what they're getting into. We want to make sure that they get back the results, their results and the overall results, treat them with respect. And by having patients involved in all of the different stages of the planning and development, we can influence that. And I've seen it happen quite a bit. So that's at least a start.
Thank you, Jane.
If I may, just
Mathieu, and then the question over there, please.
Yeah, sorry. Just I would like to add one thing. I think by the nature of the platform trial and the fluidity of the patient from one arm to the other, I think the governance of the trial is really important to have patient representation, patient organization, being able to explain to the constituency what's going to happen in this trial, because it's maybe a good idea, but it's not full speed now, so not everybody understands. So you need to train the referent where people would turn to, say, like, what's happening? Why am I engaging to? And that would be one of the role of patient organization for sure.
I agree with you. Question there.
Sure, thanks. Erin Williams from MITRE. I am about to make a confession. I'm a lawyer. They, by some glitch in registration, let me in anyway. And I've heard that I'm pretty nice. And if you have a lawyer joke you think I haven't heard, come try to find me. I actually have a question. I've noticed a theme through the day that whenever anybody talks about the lawyers or talks about the finance people, Peter, they get this cringe and this terrible look of angst. But it seems to me, especially based on, well, my experience as a lawyer, and Peter, your fantastic presentation, that there's a lot that we can do to actually enable the process. So I would love to hear actually from the other panelists what the major barriers are to engaging in finance and law. Is it mostly language? Is it that we traditionally say no to things? And I'd love to hear from Peter what types of things that you see that would make science more investable. What could be done in the whole enterprise to make it more attractive so that the capital that's now captive outside can be liberated and come into the system?
Thanks a lot. Maybe we could give one key thing from each of you that you would give in response to the question. Eric, should we start with you?
I can start. So, I mean, again, Laura's probably better to answer this than I am, but it's solvable, right? So you'd think that getting multiple companies to cooperate in one study, dealing with academics and, sometimes another organization as a sponsor for the study, there's a lot of parties there and a lot of, indemnification and IP type stuff. And she may want to comment, I'm sure it wasn't easy, but sort of once you have the precedent, at least for us, once we sort of get through that with one version of this, it then becomes very easy for us to sort of, take that learning and do it with others. And there are other examples for, we collaborate with FNIH in the biomarker consortium around, again, sort of pre-competitive efforts to look at biomarkers, and it's the same sort of thing. I think it starts off with, it could be sort of a daunting task, but it does seem to be solvable. So, and maybe it's again because our lawyers are friendly too. I don't know, but right.
I'd only comment. I think that it's a value proposition, and if there was no value to you, you wouldn't have done it, right? And I would say that Merck was willing to take a risk on going forward and made some decisions about what to put in. I mean, it really paid off for you with Pevro, and it was an amazing finding, and it has changed the field. And it's changed it for everyone, by the way, in the industry. That's not a bad thing. That's a good thing. Everyone learns faster. We get to better combinations. It is a little risky, and it's hard to manage it all, but what you've got to focus on is what's the value proposition. There's got to, the idea of learning together and working on it. And when we set it up, the idea was, I remember David Chang from Amgen said, when he was at Amgen, said at the beginning, he said, that's okay, if Pfizer's, EGFR1 inhibitor is in the trial and it succeeds, I'm going to develop mine. And if it doesn't, I'm not going to develop mine. So that there's too much of the stuff that's underground where people aren't learning. So I think the value proposition is, yeah, some people is going to take the risk and they'll learn and they'll get ahead and maybe not, but it'll help inform the field so we will waste less time and the combinations people come forward with are better. I hope you found it worthwhile.
But I think your question made me think about why is it that people dislike lawyers so much? And I'll tell you, I think the answer might be in this room and something that Gigi started us with. We're all here to work on a common solution, and we have to understand the trade-offs. And lawyers are there to represent a particular part of that silo. And at least in my experience, lawyers are not trying to figure out how to trade off with everything else. They're there to represent and only to protect their particular party. I don't know if that's true, but that's been my experience in general. And to some extent, I think the finance also is, I'm there to maximize my profit. And I can find and play my game. You know, I'm not there to look at the whole system. And it's one of the reasons why I think it's so important to get the payers involved, because they sort of have to pay out to a lot of different players, and they can sort of maybe see the bigger picture and the better good and try to balance off these different needs. Maybe I could be totally wrong. I never thought about this issue before.
I'd like, actually, can I just add one thing? I would just remind everybody that you're a lawyer and you're a patient. I'm an investor and I'm a patient. You know, we're all married to patients. We've got kids that are patients. You know, we're all affected by this stuff. So we're all wearing multiple hats. And thanks for standing up to us, for us, you know, investors at the bottom of the totem pole. We keep you from being lonely down there.
That's the first time I've ever heard that.
You know, but there also isn't a totem pole or a hierarchy if we remember that we're all patients and we're all affected and we all just represent different resources around here. So, you know, I hope you didn't come away thinking that I'm representing some sort of one chess piece on the board. I'm trying to help visualize, for the benefit of everybody here and anybody who wants to brainstorm with us, the whole damn chessboard so that we can figure out how to collaborate. Right? At the end of the day, I think lawyers represent their clients. So I don't think lawyers have. What do the clients want?
Well, we're going to need to watch times to Naomi and then Mathieu, and then we need to finish.
Oh, well, I like lawyers. I'm married to one. I have two brothers who are lawyers. I even spent a year in law school. So I don't have these feelings at all. And in my environment, I've actually had the opportunity to work with lawyers who, one, admired our business unit and wanted to help us get done what we wanted to get done.
Okay. Mathieu, last word.
Yes, great question. I'm going to answer something that might not be a question, but have you ever read a contract between a patient organization and a pharmaceutical industry and a company? It's unreadable, right? The patient to engage with the company might need to sell a kidney if they're lucky, the heart if they're not really lucky. It's unreadable. But engaging with the lawyers too late only slow down the process. And everybody see lawyers are the pain in the butt. But they're not. They're just a part in the game. And if we need to just discuss with them earlier, because compliance is important, because legal issues are important, and we cannot avoid them, period. It's super easy. So we need to engage with them as early as possible, because they are not just pain, they're just part of the solution.
Okay, unfortunately I'm going to have to draw it to close there. I will leave, having spent 10 years at Novartis, with the key question for all stakeholders, starting with lawyers. Tell me how we should do this, don't tell me what I can't do. With that, I think plays for all panels. Thank you very much to the participants, and thanks for attending.